Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Few conflicts in the world are as confounding, as tribal, and as sad as Haiti. A nation where in recent times the horrors of kidnapping, murder, and gang warfare are often the norm. Where efforts by the U.S. and the United Nations to stabilize the country have essentially failed. It is a place both turbulent and difficult. A place with a long and conflicted history of instability, yet citizens repeatedly trying to reach for democracy, only to see the efforts fail and the options for the future continuing to narrow. The assassination last week of Haiti's president in his own home has, some would argue, brought the nation closer to being a failed state. It's a place where the names of the players are not household words here in the U.S., where the complexity of the competing factions contrasts with the simplicity of violence. Given all that, it's important to have someone who can help us understand the chaos that is happening less than 700 miles from our shores. We're going to do that today with my guest, Amy Wilentz. She's a Nation contributing editor, the author of the previous books about Haiti, The Rainy Season, and A Letter from Haiti. She's written extensively about Haiti for The Nation and teaches literary journalism at the University of California, Irvine. It is my pleasure to welcome Amy Wilentz to the Who, What, Why podcast. Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff.
First of all, talk a little bit about your initial interest in Haiti. You've been writing about it for decades. Tell us a little bit about how you first became attracted to Haiti.
You know, I was working at Time magazine as a lowly staff writer, and it was kind of an alienating writer's job in those days where you just sat there on the 25th floor in Manhattan and waited for people who were really doing the reporting to send in their reports, and then you wrote them up. And it was a weird time for me as a writer. I was quite young, and I was living on the Upper West Side of New York near Columbia University, and up there were lots of Haitian refugees. And I was a French speaker, and the Haitian refugees, these guys usually, who were driving cabs in New York, they would gather on corners near my house, and they would be just yelling at each other about Haitian politics in Creole. And I could understand a little, but I couldn't really understand it. But there were all these newspapers there, too, put out by the Haitian immigrants and refugees. And I would read their newspapers, and I saw that the Duvalier dictatorship, Papa Doc's dictatorship, then run by his son, the president for life, Jean-Claude Duvalier, was about to fall. And I thought, oh, that would be cool. I'd love to go down there and see what happens when the dictatorship comes to an end. And so I did. And that was it. I watched the dictatorship fall. It was the most exciting moment probably in my life still until now, except for the birth of my children. and you know, I was hooked. It's an incredible place. I love it very much. And it's a lot better than it is often described.
Talk about that. What was the draw? What is it that got you hooked that I think people reading about it today and hearing the worst of it don't understand?
Well, it's a vibrant Caribbean culture. It's a mix of the French culture, African cultures, and then all the other cultures of the Caribbean, American, Dutch, British, everything. So it's a nice sort of mixing pot there. And then, you know, the arts there are incredible, dance and artwork, fine arts, all of it inflected by voodoo. The music is incredible. You know, it's just, and the people are charming and intelligent. I mean, down to the very lowest on the economic pole to the very highest on the economic pole. Really interesting, charismatic people.
Why has governance been such a horrible issue for the country all these years?
Because, you know, people used to say to me, they would say, why is Haiti like that? That's how people talk, especially white people, if I may say so. Why is Haiti like that? And I would go, like what? And they'd say, you know, so dysfunctional, blah, 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 blah. They would say, after all, it's only like 500 miles from the United States. It's a little more than that, but that's what they would say. And for a long time, I had trouble answering. And I would say, well, it's historical, the history of slavery, blah, blah, blah. But then I realized I should just throw the question back at them. Yeah, it's only 500 miles from the United States. That's why it's the way it is. Because forever and a day, the United States has been mixing in a very negative way in Haitian affairs. And that has been a huge problem. It's caused both a cycle of dependency by Haitian governments, but also they've chosen the wrong people to support in so many cases, the United States has. I just want to be clear. I don't blame the United States for all of Haiti's problems, but it hasn't been a healthy partner, and that has had its effect.
And how is that effect filtered down today? Certainly some of it comes from, as you've talked about in your writing, all the money that was thrown in there as a result of the 2010 earthquake. But going back further than that, how have some of those mistakes on the part of the United States and others filtered down to the kind of problems, to the kind of failures that we're seeing today?
They're still ongoing. But I would say that beginning with the 1915 occupation of Haiti by the U.S. Marines that lasted 19 years, there was a kind of takeover of the Haitian government, so that the outsiders contracted with each other to build things. They hired cheap Haitian labor to do everything. So that was good. Haitians got jobs of a sort, not always paid in money, sometimes paid in food, but it's something. And so during this occupation, basically there were two structures, the structure of the occupation running the country, and then this sort of false structure of a government for Haitians that was under the tutelage of the United States and did what was required by the United States. So that was not exactly institution building by the United States. It was sort of a Haitian facade on an American occupation. And after that, then there was the Duvalier dictatorship, which the United States supported, and that wasn't good for Haiti because that was a very corrupt government. It may not be that Papa Doc himself was financially corrupt, but he was a very hard, iron-fisted dictator, and all the people around him were corrupt. And then what happened because of that, since no one was really doing much for the people of Haiti, all of these do-gooder non-governmental organizations moved in to Haiti to try to help. And they sort of replaced the government again so that the government didn't have to do anything. And I think what was created eventually by the combination of the international community, especially in the United States, and then all these non-governmental groups and missionaries, they created a secondary government so that the Haitian government was really created as a corruption machine. It was there just to steal and not to do its job. And then with the elections, the sort of false elections of Michel Martelly and then Jovenel Moïse right in a row that were given a stamp of approval by the United States and the Organization of American States, but were not really free and fair elections. They were kind of fiddled elections to make it to come out right with these two guys being the leaders. I think that was the last straw. These two guys were not good leaders. Mickey Martelly is a very talented compas singer. He's a musician. He wasn't meant to lead a country. He's not an above-board leader. And his chosen successor, Jovenel Moïse, was, if possible, even worse than he and more corrupt.
Go back a little bit and talk about that period in the 90s during the time of Aristide when the U.S. essentially looked the other way with respect to his overthrow.
Well, I can't say the U.S. was responsible for overthrowing him, but the U.S. certainly did not caution the people who led the two coups against Aristide not to go forward with them. I think there was a green light or an understanding that this was an acceptable move by the United States. And so Aristide was the first free and fair, democratically elected president of Haiti. And that was in 1990. He was elected. He took power in 1991. And shortly thereafter, in 1991 also, he was ousted in a military coup. So that was under George Bush Sr., or as we call him, Papa Bush in Haiti. And then when Clinton came to the White House, Clinton thought, let's put this guy back. He's like the good guy. He's the one who wants the right things. And the generals who took over from him are doing a terrible job and killing a lot of people. Let's put him back in. So we had a mini occupation then with the Americans putting Aristide back in. he served out a few years of his term, and then he ran again later on in 2000 and was ousted again in 2004. So he won again and was ousted again. And he was a guy who, he was a charismatic leader. He was a progressive, so he was all about, education for the people, fixing the economy, not allowing a stranglehold of certain class on the economy, but distributing things and wealth and food to the people. He wanted a rational kind of government for the people. And that didn't stand well with the ruling classes, not because they're mean, nasty people, although they may be, but because they were enriching themselves with the monies that would then otherwise go to the Haitian people, and that they couldn't see their way around that. So Aristide was ousted 2 times with American approval. So he was ousted the first time under Papa Bush and the second time under Baby Bush, with this little window of Clintonianism in between that allowed him to come back to the country.
And talk about the frustration of the Haitian people, because it does seem that with, if not literally, it does seem that with each election there's less and less participation. Yeah,
the election of Jovenel Moïse, interestingly, was like 20% of the voters, the eligible voters in Haiti, voted. And he didn't even win a stunning majority of that 20%. So that's why I say it wasn't a legitimate election. First of all, they're very disappointed and disaffected about elections. And it would take a very honest, approachable leader for them to begin to feel confidence again in the idea of electoral democracy. And it would take what we call in Haiti a concertation, a grouping together of the progressive and grassroots forces that are very, very interesting in Haiti, and of whom there are very many working very hard to help the Haitian people. It would take a coming together of those groups as an interim consensus government to really move Haiti forward toward real elections that the Haitian people would trust and would vote in. And it would, of course, take a pacification of the streets of Haiti, which are now run by very well-armed gangs with very many expensive vehicles, funded by members of this business mafia and members of certainly some opposition parties, but also government-controlled gangs as well.
Does it matter at this point who's responsible for the assassination? It does seem that Moïse had so many enemies that it's almost impossible to tell.
One guy who worked in Haiti in intelligence capacity in the 1990s said about the assassination of Moïse that all the people around Moïse at his death, if there's any guidance, all of them will profit from his death except for him. And that there will be what the guy called a feast by these people, because they will go back to all the corruption that they were interested in the first place. So I personally think it does matter who did it. I don't know if we'll ever find out, because I believe the investigation that the Haitians are running, while fascinating and a lot like a television show, will not find the real intellectual authors of this, because I believe they're protected. They're protected by exactly the people who are running the investigation. No one really wants to unmask them, because it's very, very dangerous to unmask them. But if they continue to be the ones running Haiti, I don't predict anything good for Haiti.
Talk about the institutional collapse, the fact that there seems to be really no legislature, no judicial system, but a really non-functioning government at this point.
Well, if you are a president with dictatorial tendencies, the first thing you do is get rid of the legislature, and that was what Jovenel Moïse did. He did it. I mean, he didn't go in with his goons and shoot up the legislature, although there was some shooting at some points. He just let them lapse. So what would happen was, they term out, and he doesn't call legislative elections. At the point of his death, at the moment of his death, there were remaining in the legislature 10 senators. That's it. No lower house, and the Senate reduced to 10 members. So that was one thing he did. Then the next thing he did was fire judges and not appoint new ones. So the judiciary was very reduced. And the one person who would be able to replace him, I believe constitutionally, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He died of COVID, one of the many people dying of COVID now, because the government has not offered any vaccines at all to any of the Haitian people at all. There are no vaccines in Haiti. In fact, Jovenel Moïse could not find a way to get even the least vaccine into Haiti, much less the advanced ones that require refrigeration and continual energy sources. So that's the judiciary. Outside of town, when mayors' terms lapsed, he did not call elections. No elections were held for them. And so he would replace them with his own appointees, meaning that he extended the web of his personal control out into the countryside through these figures. So really, he was establishing a kind of dictatorship. And I believe that the intellectual authors of his assassination were not too happy about that, because they saw that all the power would then be in his hands, including the power to steal. And the power to steal is very important in Haiti. And he had already told some of the people in these families in this so-called mafia that they were not going to get their same government contracts at the ports and at the customs offices, and that he was going to change things up a bit. And that may be one of the things that led to his assassination. I'm not sure, of course.
Where does the army and the police stand in all of this right now?
Well, Aristide, quite sagely, after he was ousted twice by the Haitian army, disbanded the Haitian army. But I think it's under Martelly, that is Moïse's predecessor, they were re-upped. And so there is a limited Haitian army. It was thought, like, by Aristide, what's the point of having an army in Haiti? We're not invading anyone. No one's invading us. So they're only used to stage coups. Let's stop. But now they're back. And then there's the Haitian National Police, which has been trained on and off by American advisors over the years, but is pretty much a minimal force. Both are minimal forces with poor training and very unprofessional. So that's where they are. I mean, that's one of the things that really concerns me, is that I've seen the army go up against these gangs, and it hasn't been a happy occasion for the army and for the police. And I worry that it's going to be very difficult to disarm the gangs. If Haiti can find a way forward that is not a Moïse or Martelly way, and opens up Haiti for Haitians to help in the decision-making for their country, I worry about how that can be done with the kind of heavy arms and gangs that are still roaming the streets of the capital.
You talked about leadership before. Is there anyone on the political scene today that might be the kind of leader that could pull this together, as you were talking about previously? I
think there are plenty of them, actually. I wouldn't, I won't name any names, because I do worry about the possibility of further assassinations. They want what they want, whoever did this assassination, and they don't want the things that are dangerous for them. And the thing that would be most dangerous for them is a real popular government that controls the strength of the Haitian economy and actually makes it work for the people rather than for the wealthy. So I'm hesitant to name names, but there are very distinguished, intelligent, well-educated people in the sort of progressive circle, the wide progressive circle, who speak the kind of English the Americans like to hear, but who have really good ideas for the future of the country, and who have, and I think this is the most important thing, even a person like that, Haitians don't want unless Haitians can contribute. They don't want some fabulously well-spoken progressive who's not just absolutely addicted to doing the right thing for the Haitian people.
What should the U.S. be doing at this point?
I think the U.S. should be doing something new. And that is, I think they should be supporting a broad-based Haitian interim government with like a council of wise people representing various sectors of the economy and the political entity that can move forward with both programs for the people and plans for a democratic election in the future whenever the gangs are finally pacified. And by pacified, I don't mean taken out and shot. I mean reintegrated into a real Haitian society, disarmed, given work, made to feel that they're important again instead of just like big, swaggering criminals. And, it can be done. It has been done in other countries. It can be done in Haiti.
Given what you said earlier about the people that were responsible for the assassination want what they want and they're, determined to get it, how is anything going to go forward at this stage?
Well, I think that's where the international community comes in. Haitians don't like to be run by anyone outside. They don't love their own leaders necessarily, but they don't like to be run by outside occupations or sort of hidden outside control. What they want is accompaniment. They want allies. They want support. But they want to be the ones who are in charge and who go to the Americans and say, hey, we have this great idea. We want to do this. How could you help us out with this idea? The grassroots really supports it. They want to do such and such in the shanty towns. Let's figure out how to do it. And we know you have money. We know you have ideas. How can you help us with this? Same thing with the demobilization of the gangs. Of course, the outside community could be very helpful in this. And don't forget, there's also the Haitian diaspora, which is an incredibly influential, well-educated population of experts in so many fields. It's an incredible group of people that could be helping in Haiti and who want to help in Haiti.
What's the biggest mistake that the U.S. could make at this point? What would be the worst thing for us to do?
Depending on how the situation plays out, obviously, I would say the worst thing would be to go in with a force, an armed force, a 10,000 man and woman force. The next worst thing would be to choose one of the three men who's declared himself president of Haiti and go forward with elections on a timetable close to the one that they were trying to do with Moise. That was never going to work, and that will never work with any of those three guys. So that's the other worst thing that could happen. I got a little feeling that maybe they're trying to avoid that from the comments that were made by Jen Psaki at the White House yesterday after the very brief mission of the U.S. officials to Haiti. I got a good feeling there, but I don't know if it's just stalling while they figure out what it is they're really doing.
Can things unravel even worse in Haiti right now? There is this sense of it being almost a failed state. How bad can it get, or are we there now?
It's a good question. In a way, we're there now, but it could get worse. And there may be forces that want to make it worse to sort of tempt the United States to come in with armed forces, bust up the streets, totally let the gangs run crazy, kill a few more people, and, turn out the lights and cut off the gas and see what chaos ensues in order to get the U.S. in there, put a strong man in power, et cetera. So I think that could happen. And I think that Haitian people will have to suffer through a few more weeks of not knowing what's happening and being afraid to go out on the streets. And instability is scary for everyone, but it's very destructive for the poor because you can't get out. You can't earn your few pennies that you use to buy food. It's very, very difficult when there's insecurity on the ground for the masses of poverty-stricken people in Haiti. It's a place where when you hear the word poverty-stricken, you know why we say stricken. Mostly we forget why that word is there, but they're really struck with it.
And as you alluded to before, there is the overlay of COVID to all of this.
Yes, there's the overlay of COVID. There are very few masks being worn in Haiti. People want to wear them, but they're not available. There's some homemade masks that can be very amusing because they're made out of household things. But there's no government plan to distribute masks. And there are very few ventilators. Beyond that, there isn't even a lot of oxygen. And then when you have gangs roaming the streets, you are, as doctors have told me, you're very reluctant to put all your oxygen in a truck and send out your staff onto the roads to go to a hospital that's called you that needs oxygen. You just don't want to do it because you could get intercepted and your people could be harmed. So there's not that much movement of goods right now through the city for fear of the gangs.
What about immigration out of the country? Are there people trying to escape the country right now? And if so, where are they going?
There are always people trying to leave Haiti, both for financial reasons, to find their fortune elsewhere, and because they're afraid of the violence. So, yeah, of course there are people trying to leave. There are fewer boat people than there used to be. I think mostly because it's so dangerous. And right now, it's hard to leave because the airport is intermittently closed, and the kinds of flights that people trying to flee the country have been taking are not available. So there were flights to Brazil, cheap flights to Brazil. A lot of Haitians took that to get out of the country over the past few years, and then they would land in Brazil and start a long, long trek up through Panama to the border with the United States. So I think that's pretty much been shut down for the moment, but we'll start up again once the coup moment is over, or the assassination moment, whatever you want to call it.
Is there a role beyond the U.S. for the international community, for the United Nations? Is there anything that could be contributed in that regard?
They're all part of the same band of brothers. It's called the Core Group. And the Core Group is the U.S., the OAS, the Organization of American States, the UN, the EU, France, Canada, the Dominican Republic, and a few other countries. And this group is the one that got together to approve the Moïse election and the Martelly election. But they're, one, they're smart. Two, they have a lot of dissension even in their ranks. So, yeah, there's a role for all of them and each of them to play. And they can hold back on approving one of the three clowns, as I call them, who want to be president. They can hold back on a military intervention by any one of them, or they can join into it. We don't know what they're really going to do. I don't think they know what they're really going to do yet. But yes, there's a role for everyone to play. The UN played a big role after the second ouster of Aristide, when it came in with a peacekeeping force in 2004 and stayed for 13 years until 2017. That was a big intervention by the UN.
And finally, what do you see as a rough timeline for this playing out right now?
I think some decisions will be made in the next week. I don't think the United States wants to get involved in a military adventure as it's pulling out of Afghanistan. And I think that one of the things that really worries me is that what's happening in Haiti with the rise of Moïse's attempt at dictatorship, and then this assassination where we don't know who will come out of it, and then what's going on in Venezuela, in Mexico, in Brazil, the rise of the hard right wing. I see it as a concerted effort to destroy democracy in Latin America. I don't know why it's all happening now, but it seems also to be happening in Cuba. It's like some kind of capitalist intervention in the democracy movement in Latin America, and that Haiti is now falling into that line too. And so we'll see what can come out of this. I hope that it will show, because Haiti is always so inventive and different, I hope it'll show that there is a way that moves, instead of toward the strong man, away from the strong man, away from the Trump model, and towards some much more democratic, freer, economically fair model.
Amy Wilentz, I thank you so much for spending time with us today here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Thanks a lot for letting me be on the show.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.